Let me tell you something that makes a great many financial advisors uncomfortable. The reason most people feel broke has much less to do with how much they earn than with the fact that they are running their financial life without a system. I have watched this for a very long time. I have watched highly paid professionals live like hostages to their own paycheck. I have watched intelligent people, hardworking people, disciplined people in every other part of life remain one unpleasant month away from panic. And I have watched people with modest incomes build a kind of quiet financial stability that looked almost unfair to those earning much more. The difference was rarely intelligence. It was rarely brilliance. It was almost never a secret investment. It was order. That is where I want to begin, not with flashy strategies, not with heroic stories about getting rich overnight, not with the performance theater you see online where everything is reduced to six-figure side hustles, money mindset, and recycled slogans, pretending to be wisdom. I want to begin with a more practical truth. If your money does not move through a clear sequence, then every good intention you have will eventually be broken by ordinary life. That is the mother line of this whole story. Most people do not fail financially because they never cared. They fail because they try to do step 5 before they have finished step 1. And then they wonder why the structure keeps collapsing. They open an investment account before they know their real cash flow. They try to build wealth while high. Interest debt is still chewing through them. They talk about retirement while having no emergency buffer at all. They automate nothing, measure nothing, and then blame themselves for not being more disciplined. That is not discipline failing. That is sequence failing. And once you see that clearly, a very different kind of 6-month reset becomes possible. Not a fantasy reset, a real one. A reset built on the right order. That is what I want to give you. Warren Buffett once said that accounting is the language of business. I would push it one step further. Accounting is the language of adult life. And most people are wandering through their financial life functionally illiterate in it. That sounds harsh. Good harsh is useful when it is true because you cannot fix what you refuse to define. You cannot solve a leak you have not actually found. You cannot build a future on estimated numbers, vague feelings, and whatever your checking account happens to look like on a Friday after payday. That is why the first step is not budgeting. It is not investing. It is not cutting lattes. It is not even debt payoff. The first step is reality. You need your real income, not your salary, not the number your employer promised you in the offer letter, not the annual figure divided by 12 because it looks neat in your head. Your real income is the number that lands in your account after taxes and mandatory deductions have already taken their piece. That is the number your life is actually being funded by. Everything else is fiction. This is one of the first places people quietly sabotage themselves. They build plans off gross income. They tell themselves they make a certain amount. Then the plan fails because the money that actually arrives is much less than the money they used in their imagination. Imagination is expensive when it enters a budget. I want you to pull your pay slips. Look at what actually lands, that is your baseline. Now there is an important nuance here, and the source is right to insist on it. If money is being diverted before it reaches your account into an employer retirement plan or workplace pension, add that back in for purposes of understanding the full flow. You will categorize it later. But right now I want the whole river visible. I do not want a sanitized number that hides where part of your compensation is already going. If you are self-employed, the problem is even more dangerous. A lot of self-employed people make the oldest mistake in the book. They see revenue and emotionally treat it like income. It is not. Part of that money already belongs to the government. You are only holding it temporarily. If you budget against gross business receipts without first carving out estimated taxes, then you are building your life on money that was never yours to begin with. That feels fine until tax season arrives and tears a hole through your confidence. I have watched that happen to too many people. Do not do it. If you are self-employed, subtract your estimated tax liability before you call the rest of the money yours. Only then do you have a real number. That is step 1. Now we move to step 2. And this is where many people begin feeling the first wave of discomfort. You gather the statements, all of them, bank accounts, credit cards, automatic payments, subscriptions, loan statements, anything money touches. Do not rely on memory. Memory is flattering. Statements are not banks. Try to categorize spending automatically, and sometimes they get close enough to be helpful. Fine, use that as a draft, but do not trust it as final truth. One forgotten subscription, one recurring expense hiding under miscellaneous, one insurance ad on one app renewal you signed up for in a different mood 2 years ago can sit there draining you quietly for a very long time. This is the moment most people want to look away. I understand it. It feels like standing on a scale after 6 months of pretending your habits have not changed. But the number does not become less real because you avoided it. Avoidance does not soften reality. It only delays your ability to improve it. So, look, then sort the spending into 3 buckets. This is where the fog begins to clear. The first bucket is fundamentals: rent or mortgage, groceries, utilities, transport to work, basic insurance, the things that keep the machine standing. The things you would still have to pay if income got hit tomorrow and you were trying to survive rather than decorate your lifestyle. These stay. They are not negotiable in the short run. The second bucket is lifestyle restaurants, trip streaming services, shopping that goes beyond necessity, gym memberships, nights out, subscriptions you may enjoy but do not require. This is where people tend to become melodramatic. They think once a thing lands in lifestyle, it has been morally condemned. That is childish. A human life needs pleasure. The goal is not to strip your existence down to beige walls and guilt. The goal is to know what is a choice and what is a necessity. Lifestyle spending is not evil. It is simply where the real decisions live. The third bucket is future you emergency fund contributions, extra debt payments, retirement savings, investments, anything that is not trying to maintain the present but is trying to strengthen the future. This bucket is where the great divide begins. Not because the people who fund it are saints, because the people who ignore it stay permanently exposed. Now, when you lay out all 3 buckets honestly, you will probably learn something unpleasant. For many people, especially anyone under middle age in the modern cost structure, the fundamentals bucket is already far larger than the old rules would have led them to expect. This is where I need to correct one of the most overused pieces of personal finance advice in the world, the 50 divided by 30 divided by 20 rule, 50% on needs, 30% on wants, 20% on savings and debt reduction. It is neat. It is memorable. It is clean enough to print on a poster. It is also badly disconnected from what many actual people are living through. Now, when that framework became popular, rents in many American cities were dramatically lower than they are now. Energy was cheaper. Insurance was cheaper. Transportation was cheaper. Real wages had not been hollowed out by inflation. In the same way, the rule remained, reality moved. That is how old frameworks quietly become sources of shame. A young person today runs the numbers, sees that fundamentals are swallowing 65%, 70%, maybe 80% of income, and concludes that they are broken because they do not fit a formula written for a different cost world. Number, they are not broken. The formula is outdated. This matters because shame is useless, diagnosis is useful. So use 50 divided by 30 divided by 20 as a diagnostic if you want, but never as a moral law. If your fundamentals are taking 70% of income, the lesson is not. You are failing. The lesson is you have very little margin. That means you cannot afford sloppiness, you cannot afford unknown leaks, you cannot afford repeated surprises. Your system has to be tighter than someone whose fundamentals consume 45%. That is the right conclusion. If your lifestyle bucket is still swallowing 35% or 40% while the future you bucket is nearly empty, then the lesson is different. Now you do have room to make adjustments. Now you are not living under pure structural pressure. You are making present comfort choices that are crowding out future security. That is a real choice. But again, the value is in seeing it clearly, not in performing self-hatred. What matters is not whether you match some old ideal ratio. What matters is how much of your monthly life is going toward protecting your future rather than merely feeding your present. That is the question. Now, when most people hear cut spending, they immediately imagine financial cliches, coffee, avocado toast, some absurd little moral lecture built around tiny pleasures, while the serious structural costs of life are left untouched. I hate that style of advice. It insults the intelligence of the person hearing it, it trivializes major problems, and it trains people to obsess over the visible small stuff while ignoring the invisible medium-sized leaks that actually matter. So do not ask what tiny pleasure should I performatively eliminate. Ask a better question for every line in the lifestyle bucket. Am I still actively choosing this, or am I just passively paying for it? That distinction changes everything. A subscription you love and actually use every week is a choice. A subscription you forgot about 2 years ago is a leak. A gym membership you use 3 times a week is a choice. A gym membership you have not touched since the spring is a leak. Streaming you watch nightly is a choice. Streaming you forgot was still billing is a leak. That is the frame, not austerity. Intentionality, the goal is not to make life joyless. The goal is to stop funding a lifestyle by inertia. Even reclaiming $50, $80, $100 a month of passive spending and moving it into the future. U-Bucket changes the whole trajectory of a decade. That is not dramatic enough for social media. Too bad. It is true. Now we come to the piece almost everyone wants to skip because it feels unsexy. The emergency fund, I cannot tell you how many people do every apparently intelligent thing in the wrong order. They open investment accounts, they buy index funds, they learn about compounding, they get excited, they think they are finally in the game. Then life does what life always does. The transmission fails, the boiler dies, the dog needs surgery, a contract gets canceled, hours get cut, a parent gets sick, and the money they were so proud to be investing gets yanked back out at exactly the wrong time. Sometimes at a market loss, always with frustration, always with the feeling that the plan never seems to hold. The problem was not that investing was wrong. The problem was that the circuit breaker did not exist. That is what an emergency fund is, not a savings goal, not a cute little side account, a circuit breaker. The thing that stops one bad week from turning into 6 months of regression. Without it, almost every financial plan you build is fragile. That is why it comes before serious wealth building. Now, the standard advice says 3 to 6 months of expenses. That is not wrong eventually. It is often terrible advice as a starting point. Why? Because the human brain responds badly to goals that feel impossibly far away. A person with almost nothing saved who hears build 6 months of expenses often does not feel inspired. They feel overwhelmed, and overwhelmed people delay. So start with 1 month of fundamentals only, not total spending, not lifestyle, not fantasy numbers. Bucket 1 only, rent, groceries, utilities, transport, basic survival. For many people that will land somewhere between $1,200 and $2,500, depending on circumstances. That is close enough to feel real. And when you hit that number, something important happens. Yes, you have more safety. But more than that, you have proof that you can build. Proof that money can accumulate instead of disappearing, proof that you are not trapped in pure reaction anymore. That psychological win is not a side effect. It is part of the asset once you hit 1 month. Now 3 months begins feeling plausible. Then 6. Now we come to the next question that needs honesty, not slogans. Debt versus emergency fund. Which first, the answer depends on the interest rate. That is the honest answer. If you are carrying credit card debt at 18%, 22%, 28%, then that debt is compounding against you violently every month in that situation. It usually makes little sense to build a fat cash cushion at 4%, while a debt machine is burning you at 5 times the pace. The right move there is usually to build a minimal buffer first, maybe $500 to $1,000. Enough to keep one small emergency from immediately driving you back onto the card, then attack the high-interest debt with everything you have, because eliminating a 22% drag is a guaranteed return that almost no investment can promise. That is arithmetic, not opinion. Once the high-interest debt is gone, then you expand the emergency fund properly. Low-interest debt is different. A reasonable mortgage, some government student loans, other debt where the rate is modest enough that liquidity has greater value than accelerated payoff. In that case, building the emergency fund in parallel can make more sense. But the key is that you decide this deliberately, not because you feel one way or another, because you ran the numbers and respected the rates. That is adulthood. Now, where should the emergency fund sit? Not in your checking account if you can avoid it. Checking is too visible, too tempting, too frictionless. A proper emergency fund should be accessible, but not so accessible that every bright object in your life can reach it in one impulsive second. A separate bank is useful. A high-yield savings account is useful. The friction of needing a transfer that takes a little time is useful. That delay is not an inconvenience. It is a defense. It forces you to ask, is this actually an emergency or just urgency dressed up as one? That question saves people a lot of money. Now let us talk about debt properly. Debt is not immoral. That is important to say because people hear the word and immediately moralize. Debt is a tool. A mortgage on a reasonably priced house can be a tool. A sensible education loan attached to a real increase in earning power can be a tool. A 24% credit card balance hanging around for things you barely remember buying is not a tool. That is a hemorrhage, and the first thing you must do is face it in full. Write down every debt, every creditor, every balance, every minimum payment, every interest rate. Not because self-punishment is noble, because vagueness is expensive. Specific problems can be solved. Vague dread cannot. Now, once the debts are on paper, you pick a method, not a mood. A method. The avalanche method is mathematically better. Rank debts by interest rate, highest first, pay minimums on everything else. Throw every extra dollar at the top rate. When that one dies, roll the payment into the next. This saves the most money. If your motivation is strong enough to follow cold math, this is the best answer. The snowball method is psychologically better for many people. Rank debts by smallest balance first. Kill the smallest, take the freed up payment, and roll it into the next. Mathematically, it may cost more interest overall psychologically. It creates visible wins faster. And for a lot of people, visible wins are what keep them in the game. The wrong approach is the one most people drift into. Randomness, a little extra here, a little extra there, whichever bill scared them most that week. That creates maximum confusion and minimum progress. Pick one path, commit, do not improvise every month. And yes, while you are in debt elimination mode, the lifestyle bucket may need to tighten temporarily, not forever. That is important, forever. Frugality is not the goal. A finite sprint is the goal. 3 hard months can eliminate a card balance that has been poisoning your budget for years. And once that minimum payment disappears, you have not only reduced debt, you have bought back monthly cash flow. That is how a reset works, not by admiring the idea of being debt-free, by reclaiming your future dollars from past mistakes. Now assume the high-interest debt is gone. Assume the emergency fund is moving toward 3 to 6 months of fundamentals. At this point, something important has happened. You have done what most people never do. You have built a real foundation. Only now does full-scale wealth building become sturdy. This is the moment people usually want to skip to because it is exciting. But if you skip to it too soon, the earlier steps break you. Now it can work. And the next priority is obvious. Capture every employer match available to you. Every one. This is not advanced investing. It is arithmetic. If your employer matches retirement contributions and you are not capturing the full match, you are leaving part of your compensation on the table. That is not a metaphor. It is your money. A 100% immediate return on part of your contribution is almost unbeatable. Take it. Then maximize tax advantaged accounts to the extent your situation allows. Different countries have different wrappers. 401k, IRA, Roth, IRA, ISA, pension, SIP, whatever fits your system, the principle is the same. Money growing inside a tax, sheltered or tax. Advantage structure compounds more efficiently than money exposed to annual tax drag. Again, not sexy, still true. And now comes another distinction people need badly. Saving is not investing. Saving is storage. Investing is deployment. Saving belongs to money you may need soon. Emergency reserves, near-term goals, down payments, a car fund, a sabbatical, money where stability matters more than return. Investing belongs to money that can stay away for years, 5 years or more, ideally much longer. That money needs productive assets, not a sleepy account bleeding slowly to inflation. The mistake I see constantly is mismatch. People invest money they will need soon, and then are forced to sell at a bad time. Or they save money they will not touch for 20 years and lose a shocking amount of future wealth through unnecessary caution. Match the tool to the time horizon. That is foundational. And when it comes to investing itself, simplicity wins far more often than ego does. I have watched too many intelligent people convince themselves they could outsmart the market, or optimize their way around ordinary discipline, or build some dazzlingly complex scheme that would somehow compensate for a lack of patience. Most of them would have been better off doing something much more boring, low-cost broad market index funds, bought regularly, held patiently, with minimal interference, minimal fees, minimal drama. The great enemy of long-run investing is not market volatility. It is human behavior, panic selling, performance chasing, switching strategies every year and a half because last year's favorite sector now has a different acronym. The discipline to do little, to keep adding, to ignore noise, to let time carry the burden is more valuable than almost any cleverness people spend their lives trying to cultivate. Now, I want to say something that financial diagrams rarely say clearly enough. Money behavior is emotional before it is rational. That matters because if you build your plan as though you are a robot, your plan will fail the first time you behave like a person. People do not avoid budgets because budgeting is intellectually difficult. They avoid them because looking honestly at their own numbers feels like a verdict. People do not always delay debt payoff because they do not understand interest rates. They delay because paying off debt requires saying no to present relief for a future result that does not feel emotionally vivid enough yet. People do not fail to invest because no information exists. There is more financial information available now than at any point in history. They fail because starting requires admitting they have not started yet. That hurts their pride. This is why systems matter more than willpower. Willpower is episodic. Systems repeat. Automate the savings transfer on payday, before you see the money, before you can reinterpret it. Keep the emergency fund separate, so you do not have to resist it every time you log in. Set investment contributions on autopilot. Manual decisions get postponed. Standing orders get obeyed. That is how adults reduce the need for heroics. You do not win because you are always inspired. You win because the right behavior became easier than the wrong one. And now we arrive at the real timeline problem. People want 6-week transformations from systems that require 6 months to stabilize and years to become obvious. That is why they quit. They build for 10 weeks and expect to feel rich. They pay off one small debt and expect total peace. They invest for a year and expect compounding to feel like magic. That is not how it works. A 6-month money reset is not 6 months to becoming wealthy. It is 6 months to changing the direction and structure of your life so that wealth building finally has a stable platform. That is a very different goal, and it is much more realistic. Think of it like planting a tree. The first months are root months. Nothing impressive happens above ground. That does not mean nothing is happening. Most people stop in the root phase because they wanted applause too early. Do not do that. Now let me bring the whole sequence together. First, face your real after-tax income, not the flattering version, the real one. Second, lay out all spending honestly and sort it into fundamentals, lifestyle, and future you. Third, use old frameworks like 50 divided by 30 divided by 20 as diagnostics, not moral judgments. Fourth, build a 1-month fundamental expense emergency buffer. Fifth, if high-interest debt is present, attack it methodically with avalanche or snowball. Sixth, once that debt is cleared, Extend the emergency fund toward 3 to 6 months. 7th, capture every employer match and tax advantage available to you. 8th, save for short-term needs, invest for long-term ones, and keep the difference clear. 9th, automate everything important. And 10th, respect the timeline. This is not about one good week. It is about the sequence. That is the system. Not glamorous, not secret, not dependent on genius, dependent on order. And the identity shift underneath all of this is the one I care about most. Most people think financial progress is about motivation. I think it is about sequence. A motivation mindset says I need to feel ready. A sequence mindset says I need to do the next correct thing in order. A motivation mindset waits for confidence. A sequence mindset builds confidence by completing steps that make the next step easier. A motivation mindset burns hot and cools fast. A sequence mindset is quieter and far more durable. That is the difference. And once you make that shift, money stops being this shapeless emotional cloud. It becomes a process you can learn, a process you can repeat, a process you can hand to your future self instead of forcing that future self to improvise under pressure. That is the blueprint I trust. See the numbers, name the buckets, build the buffer, kill the high interest drag, protect yourself. Then build. That is how the 6-month reset actually works. Not because 6 months is magic. Because 6 months is long enough to stop guessing and start running a real system. And once the system is running, you stop feeling like money is happening to you. You start making money move where you want it to move. That is the side I would rather be on. You should too.